Casement will be talked about more because I think that so much of what he says remains so current.
Well, I think probably because he's the one that has the most contradictions at his core.
If there was never a 1916 insurrection, Casement would have been the greatest Irishman of all time.
Some prospect that in some way that one can resolve all of the contradictions in Casement's life, but Casement himself couldn't resolve them.
Roger David Casement was born in Dublin on the 1st of September 1864. The son of a Protestant father, also Roger, and a Catholic mother, Anne, Casement was orphaned by the time he was just 13 years old. And he and his 3 siblings were brought up by their uncle John in the glens of Antrim. On leaving school, Casement worked in Liverpool until 1883, when he made his first visit to Africa, and so began an extraordinary career that was to take him all over the world and into the pages of history.
One of the striking things about Casement is that the man never seems to have had a home, his own sense of rootedness somewhere. Because, he grew up, he was born in Dublin, growing up in Northern Ireland, and then spending the rest of his life basically travelling the globe.
Casement did have strong nationalist feelings as a youth, and he read widely in Irish history. He was a great admirer of Parnell, and after Parnell died, he sort of lost interest in Irish public affairs. So I think it receded into the background rather than being suppressed.
Roger Casement inherited that love of freedom from his father, who was also Roger Casement.
His father was an idealist. As a British Army officer in India, he left India to go to Hungary to support the 1848 revolution in Hungary. And so I think his personality characteristic drove him in the direction of opposing atrocities and cruelty of any type.
In May 1903, Casement is asked by the then Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne to investigate alleged atrocities in the Belgian Congo under the regime of King Leopold II. His report was completed in late 1903 and published the following February, sparking a diplomatic row and prompting new questions to be asked about colonial relations.
He began to see the African colonialism in the Congo specifically as an exploitative colonial system with many similarities to what had happened in Ireland. So at the very end of his period in Africa, he began to think very directly about Ireland.
That's what motivated him, was that he could see that there were, it's the old who benefits here, and he could see that the ones who certainly weren't benefiting were the native peoples of the Putumayo and the Congo.
He returns from his first Amazon voyage in the first days of 1911, having spent the latter 6 months of 1910 travelling into the depths of the Amazon rainforest to compile his case against a British Peruvian rubber company. Arana, who was the Peruvian owner of the rubber company that he was investigating and had a huge amount of influence and agency and power right across the Amazon region, he really would have preferred Casement to have been quietly disposed of. And it's kind of a miracle that Casement actually survived that journey, I often think.
In June 1911, it was announced that Casement was to receive a knighthood for his humanitarian work in Africa and South America. His letter of acceptance to Sir Edward Grey would have major repercussions at his trial and cast doubt over Casement's sense of loyalty.
It was significant in him receiving it, but significant also for the people giving it to him.
I suppose it was the British government's way of telling the world that they appreciated what he had done in the Congo Free State and in the Putumayo. And while Casement graciously accepted it, he was never happy with it. I suppose he felt that knighthoods and titles like that didn't go down very well with nationalists in Ireland.
He himself didn't wish to accept it, but he was persuaded that in the interests of the Putumayo campaign it was best to do so, because not accepting it might have cast a shadow and interfered with the ongoing work for the Putumayo. I think his resistance was both personal. He had a certain antipathy to public awards, but I think it was also because of his growing nationalism that he was self-conscious about how it would be viewed in the Irish nationalist community.
The knighthood, in the end, empowers Casement. But at the same time, he realises that the people who matter most to him, in other words, those who want Irish independence, won't be at all impressed by the fact that he is now titled or knighted. And so, again, this sort of duality that always seems to inform Casement's life is present.
Having assisted in founding the Volunteers in late 1913, Casement's support for the Irish cultural revival broadened to a fully fledged political effort in 1914. In July that year, he helped land 1,500 guns at Howth aboard the Asgard, assisted by Erskine Childers and Alice Stepford Green. This was to result in Casement gaining the respect at the highest level of the Irish-American leaders.
After the Howth gun-running success, he really rises to the very top of the estimations in the eyes of both Devoy and McGarrity. And they decide to entrust Casement with essentially a diplomatic mission to Germany in order to try and garner guarantees from the German government in support of Irish independence.
They had promised 2 shiploads of arms. They supplied 1. They had promised officers. They didn't send any. They had promised a submarine in the Irish Sea to cause a diversion from the west coast of Ireland. They didn't send that either. The whole thing almost collapsed because the Germans didn't think it was practical, didn't think it would work, and weren't going to risk any more than the 1 ship.
I think Casement's period in Germany is perhaps he's taken maybe too much as a scapegoat for that, because first of all, it wasn't quite Casement's plan. You know, it was planned by John Devoy, or partly planned by John Devoy and Clonaghoil in America and the United States, and I think also by the IRB in Ireland. So Casement was only one of a team. Now, one of the problems was that as the war progressed, Britain commanded the seas. So the links between both the United States and Germany and Ireland and Germany were cut off completely. So Casement was cut off from that support network, which was meant to be part of the German plan.
Communications with Devoy, which seemed to have been okay at the start, but were clearly being intercepted by British naval intelligence. And then Casement becoming more and more isolated in Germany, largely because he just can't kind of feed his network any longer. And by that stage, he has this vast network of conspirators and activists and friends and Irish sympathisers scattered around the Atlantic Rim. And by the time by late 1915, when he's in Germany, that his ability to actually communicate with them has disintegrated, evaporated, and he finds himself very vulnerable by then.
Commentators today seem to think that Casement was meant to be a recruiter of an Irish brigade, whereas what Casement actually intended doing was speaking to prisoners of war, as he had done to Irish groups around the country to encourage them to join the volunteers. He was the diplomat who would make the encouraging talks, but he wasn't meant to be an on-the-ground campaigner or organiser, and he was forced perhaps into that role, so he wasn't suited for that role.
When the Germans heard he wanted to get to Ireland, they were quite happy to get rid of him, supplied a submarine, sent Monkit and Bailey with him, and the rest is history.
When I landed in Ireland that morning, swamped and swimming on an unknown strand, I was happy for the first time in over a year. I knew this fate waited on me. I was for one brief spell happy and smiling once more. I cannot tell you what I felt. The sandhills were full of skylarks, rising in the dawn. And I was back in Ireland again.
I think in coming to Ireland from Germany, Casement was impelled by a number of things. He believed, given that the fact that he knew that sufficient German help wasn't coming, he opposed the rising. In fact, when he came, he tried to stop it. He wasn't a supporter of a symbolic gesture.
Casement really did see that without some German military input into the rising, then there was really little hope that it was going to succeed.
He knew that the supply of arms was insufficient, that the rising would be a bloodbath. He didn't want to be responsible for sending a whole lot of young men to their deaths. And his aim then was to get to Ireland, get to Dublin before the rising and try and convince the leaders that they should postpone it.
And in some ways, he was proved right in that in that diary he kept in the last days before departing from Germany for Ireland. He looked at the moral and political reasons why the rising would fail and why he objected to it. And again, that's always made his inclusion into the narrative of 1916 problematic, because he's the only leader who is executed who is essentially against the very rising himself, which makes his own execution, I suppose, slightly more problematic to understand.
I think perhaps there were two elements in the British authorities' desire to have Casement executed. One was that, in fact, they believed he was a far more central person in the planning and execution of the rising than, in fact, he had been. So there was a misinterpretation on their part. But the second element is that he had been a recognised and lauded British public servant. And I think there was a greater affront to Britain because of his support for the rising. And I think we must remember that it happened during the Battle of the Somme, when thousands of British soldiers were dying on the front. So public emotion was very high in Britain.
To have gone from being, a knight of the realm to a traitor, he had to be brought to justice. And it's hard for us to appreciate as well the anti-German feeling that was going on, that had existed in Britain from the outbreak of war right up into this period. And that was really, really vitriolic as well. And that Casement had aligned himself not so much with the Irish cause, but with Germany against Britain. Then he was now an enemy of the state. And I think that it was extremely important for the British government to actually go right to the end with this and hang him as a traitor.
They were going to make sure, no matter what happened, that Casement, number one, was going to hang, and number two was not going to hang as an Irish martyr.
When Casement arrives in London, 2 days before the rising breaks out in Dublin, he is taken to Scotland Yard and he is interrogated by the most important intelligence chiefs in the country: Basil Thompson, Blinker Hall, Admiral Hall, the head of what became MI5, a guy called Frank Hall. The transcript of that of those interrogations mentions at the very end that Basil Thompson has in his possession 2 trunks of Casement's papers. And Casement says, well, I've nothing to hide, break them open. And one assumes, although one is not directly told, that those are the trunks that contain what we now understand or call the Black Diaries.
The issue of the Black Diaries has been ingrained in the narrative of Casement's life and legacy. They are a collective name for a ledger, a notebook, and 3 actual diaries ranging from 1903 to 1911. They contain explicit homosexual content and are alleged to be written by Casement. They were discovered just before his trial, having a profound effect upon Casement's fate. Some have questioned their authenticity, claiming they were used to discredit him, but their very existence has cast a shadow over Casement's reputation.
Those diaries, what we should call them forged diaries, were introduced to prevent Casement becoming an Irish martyr.
The diaries then, after his trial, are used much more aggressively in the press to actually build stories that both dehumanize Casement in the public imagination and make him into this kind of figure who cannot be easily martyred in the Irish or indeed international imagination.
If you were to say that they were that they're authentic, then in some ways, you know, there's also a suggestion then that they couldn't have been, that forging them or faking them would have been too much of a production or beyond the capabilities or the possibilities of the Secret Service of the time. And I have to say, having looked at the way the British security establishment worked in the early 20th century, I think there's every possibility that they could have forged these.
And then they disappear from sight after his execution. And then really resurfaced in the late 50s when the British government realised that they either have to admit to the fact that this was a black propaganda campaign, or they have to come up with a set of diaries that can be passed off as those documents that were shown around in 1916.
There's every possibility that they would have had the means, motive and opportunity to do it. Whether they did it or not, that's still, I don't think we'll ever get to the end of that. But that they had the capability to do it, I think is certainly beyond doubt.
I made awful mistakes and did heaps of things wrong. Confused much and failed at much. But I very near came to doing some big thing. It was only a shadow they tried June 26th. The real man was gone.
So Casement's execution and his overthrow, his assassination, if you like, is something that requires a great deal of careful planning and strategizing. And the diaries do, in the end, play an important part in that. They're shown in early May shown to journalists, although the diaries that are eventually released in 1959 don't appear to be the documents that were shown to journalists in May 1916.
Well, during his life, the diaries played very little part in Casement's life because they only came to light during his trial, and even there they played a minor role in having him condemned and executed. In his afterlife, they have taken on a much greater importance. And if you are, as I am, a believer in the authenticity of the diaries, then you have to try to interpret his life in the light of that and insert them in some ways. And of course, there has been a huge controversy about whether they are authentic, with people lining up on both sides. And that has cast a shadow, I think, on interpretations of Casement in a very significant way.
I've always made the case over a long period of time that the diaries are forged, and they're forged for a very complicated set of reasons, which is really to do with reputation, perhaps the reputation of history above all.
Casement's short but highly significant time in Kerry had a profound effect locally, nationally, and internationally.
Because Roger Casement landed on Bannistrand in the dark at 3 o'clock on Good Friday morning, and that there was nobody there to meet him. And despite the fact that he spent 20 hours a prisoner in the RIC barrack in Tralee, and there was no attempt made to rescue him. People in Kerry feel they should remember his name and do him whatever honour they can in the years that have passed, and they have done that. In 1966, the railway station was named after him, Casement Station. In 1968, the memorial was unveiled close to the Strand in Banna, where he landed, where they landed, I should say. In 1991, there's a small stone memorial was erected with the help of Conor na Gaeilge Tralee in McKenna's Fort to mark the place where he was arrested.
Clearly, he had a major impact on the people that he met that day in Kerry, from the very fact that of the witnesses who were brought to London, and I was going to say put on trial, but in a way they themselves were put on trial because they were made a mockery of in the British press, and then when they came back, they were effectively put on trial by public opinion in Kerry and in Ireland as well. So their lives were completely transformed. But there was also the sense that Ireland had betrayed Casement by not looking after him, by not saving him, by not rescuing him, and therefore the impulse was to atone for that.
In 2016, Ireland will commemorate one of the defining events in its history, the Easter Rising. It is certain to generate debate and discussion about those involved in the planning and execution of the ill-fated rebellion. Among them, Roger Casement.
In the context of the centenary remembrance of 1916, I think Casement will probably be a peripheral figure because of his isolation in Germany. He wasn't one of the immediate planners of it, which was done between Ireland, between the IRB and the United States. And he arrived only in a peripheral way and was arrested immediately. So in a way, his participation in the Rising was not as central as that of the leaders based in Ireland. And I think I would expect that he would be recognised, but perhaps in a slightly more peripheral role than some of the other leaders.
Casement will be talked about more because I think that so much of what he says remains so current. I mean, Casement is a figure who explored ideas of corporate responsibility and environmental justice and human rights, and these are issues that we should all be concerned about today. And so there's this contemporaneity about Casement that I think makes him very appealing.
Casement is slightly different to the others in that there is the international dimension that he brings with him, and that therefore he is always discussed, and he broadens the discussion about Ireland and its search for national self-determination. He broadens that debate much more than some of the other figures in 1916, perhaps because he was outward-looking as much as inward-looking. It's hard to know, actually, at this stage, as we begin the discussion, how he's going to be talked about. But I think certainly as a complex character who embodied within him many of the contradictions that were in Ireland at the time.
I believe as well, if there was never a 1916 insurrection, Casement would have been the greatest Irishman of all time.
What one shouldn't forget is that many, among those 16 leaders who were executed and many of those who survived to tell the tale, there were some really brilliant, progressive, advanced thinkers amongst them, both men and women. And, you know, we could talk about Casement in terms of human rights and corporate responsibility, but we could also just as easily talk about Patrick Pearse's views on education, or James Connolly's views on women and social justice, and these are really the issues that should be talked about. This is if there was a spirit of 1916 that we should all be trying to hang on to, this is the spirit of 1916. It is the ideas, the real innovative thinking that accreted around these figures who have just been, to some extent, thrown into the dustbin of history because of this moment when they did bravely face up to imperial power and lost their lives for it. But there's so much more of the story to be told, and but it needs to be reframed and rethought and regurgitated in new and imaginative ways.
He just raises so many questions for us now, both us as Irish people, but as people on the planet, basically, that are just endlessly fascinating, and I think it will continue to fascinate.
People always see him as a dreamer and someone with his head in the clouds.
He was certainly an imperialist, a defender of the British Empire, even if in his later life he became anti-imperialist.
I think it's just very misleading to talk about Casement's trial through the prism of the diaries.
He was not a conformist. He was a strong, forthright, acting individual.
How the British government could give him a knighthood, and then, because he disagreed with him in their outlook, turn around and hang him.
For people who get involved in that there is some prospect that in some way that one can resolve all of the contradictions in Casement's life, but Casement himself couldn't resolve them.